We are still sitting in the Ways and Means Committee room, and it is still Wednesday, January 31st at 10:07. And, as we think about long-term and short-term options for the education fund, I think, we've talked a bunch of times, like there's going to need to be policy mechanisms to protect some payers. There's going to be policy mechanisms long-term to make spending more effective. All of that is going to happen. Likely also some new revenue is going to need to come in. We sort of bought down rates the last many years with what was essentially one-time money. And that one-time money, we don't call it that in the ed fund, but that's sort of the spiritual equivalent. And so likely we're going to need some new revenue this year to get our arms around property tax rates. And so Pat is going to share with us essentially like the list of usual suspects for doing something like this. There's certainly some that I like better than others personally, but it's sort of the standard list of usual suspects that he's going to take us through. Would you like to do this? Thank you.
Right. So Patrick Titterton, Joint Fiscal Office, as your chair just mentioned, not sure anything is going to look incredibly new or unexpected. In fact, I think most of what you'll see today, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, Julia gave a presentation on education funding levers. And so a lot of what's included in here is just a little bit more detail on a table that was towards the end that showed some estimates that we've done recently. Some other funding sources that can go into the education fund. So I'm going to share my screen. There should be slides on your committee webpage. Pop-ups I need to click out of. Great. So in addition to property taxes, there are several non-property related revenue sources that flow into the general fund. I am not going to speak on anything property related today. If you'd like to hear any more information on that, the person you need to talk to, yeah, not me. So some of the other sources in there, so the ed fund gets all of the sales and use taxes that the state collects. It gets a third of purchase and use. It gets a quarter of meals and rooms, gets the profits from the state lottery. And there are other smaller sources like certain school-based Medicaid reimbursement funds or miscellaneous revenue sources. But really the big non-property revenue sources, and really the biggest one is that sales and use component, which is what we'll focus on for the most part today. We have done some recent estimates, and the ones that I'm going to cover today are sugar sweetened beverages, which I know that we talked about last year. Applying the sales and use tax to candy, clothing above a certain threshold, and I'll talk about what that means a little bit later. And then pre-written software accessed remotely, you might know that otherwise as cloud tax. And then there's a couple other, just to give you a sort of sense of magnitude of changes that you can make to, the rate, what monkeying with the rate would look like. And also there are a lot of tax expenditures, which are they're basically appropriations in that we're not collecting the revenue from these things that we're exempting from tax. So they're basically a way that we've shrunk the base for the sales and use tax. So that's another lever that you can look at in theory to think about if you wanted to expand the base to generate more revenue. So the first one, sugar sweetened beverages. We modeled our estimate on past legislation that has come before the General Assembly. It's an excise tax, wholesalers pay it. And with this particular tax, it's a certain amount of cents per ounce. So 12-ounce can of Coke that's at a cent, that's 25 cents per an excise tax.
That's what we do with beer, right?
That, so
Sorry.
there's
If
a,
that confuses the issue, you don't even have to answer the question.
it's a little bit more complicated answer. But there's a gallonage tax. Um, so yeah, we looked at a couple of scenarios ranging from a penny to 2 pennies per ounce, for sugar sweetened beverages. And the way they're defined as non-alcoholic beverages they can be carbonated or non-carbonated. They are intended for human consumption, which I think that qualifier is kind of funny because you're not drinking, of course, you should be drinking stuff that's meant for human consumption. And it contains any kind of added sweetener, right? And this also applies to powders, like I know you can buy those cans of like powdered lemonade and you just mix it with water. So it includes stuff like that too.
The Crystal Light.
That has added sugar, right? Yes.
Well, does it count? It doesn't. Wait, so, what about non-sugar? What about Representative Beck's favorite drink?
So they don't sweeten that with sugar.
Okay.
So in this estimate, the numbers you'll see are strictly related to sugar, not what's the like stevia sweetened things? Those wouldn't be included.
And not honey sweetened things? Or is honey sugar?
Honey would be a sugar.
Okay, we can talk to an attorney and
Yeah.
talk to us about numbers. It's fine. Sorry.
I mean, so I have some what is included,
Okay.
what is not here. It doesn't get down to the granularity of honey or not. But so soft drinks, fruit beverages, as long as they have added sugar, if it's 100% fruit juice with nothing added, that's not included. Sports drinks like Gatorade, Nestle iced tea, Red Bull, that kind of stuff. So
Is this list from the streamlined sales?
yes. And so things that aren't included, so like I said, 100% fruit or vegetable juice, nothing added. Infant formula, they do often add some sugar to that, but that's not included here. Milk alternatives, diet soft drinks like was asked, and diet.
Representative?
Is the milk or diet or ready-to-drink diet, are they excluded because of the specific use of the word sugar? Or are they excluded categorically regardless of whether they're adulterated with sugar?
I think that's a great question for legislative counsel, who is not in the room right now.
Sure. Just one quick comment on that is that, I think a lot of the sugar sweetened beverages were coming out sort of along the same timeline that, the taxes on these things were coming out on a similar timeline as diet drinks became more popular. And so, their diet drinks are viewed as being sort of more healthy. And it's, in a sense, it kind of comes back to it being generally regarded as a sin tax. So you're trying to tax something to discourage consumption of that good. So not all too dissimilar to cigarette taxes.
Yeah, no, my question about the intent here is like behavior change. No, percent.
Generally, I mean, it does raise some revenue, but it has generally been viewed as something discouraging unhealthy behavior.
And since we don't even have a bill to do this on the wall, I would say I'm going to stay away from intent and say we're having a conversation about it because we're trying to raise money for the education fund and we don't necessarily need to choose this option. And if we did decide to choose this option, we could even loop in diet drinks if we wanted. And I would make sure staying with streamlined is generally a good idea. So we would want to check into that with an attorney. Yeah.
Madam Speaker, do you know if Maple is anywhere on the streamlined?
I have no idea.
Because, do you know?
I don't know specifically about Maple.
Because I see it's not on this list here you've put up on the wall. And I strongly oppose any taxation of maple. Maple is one of Vermont's most famous products and old, going way back into history. We should, do you want the full speech here? I oppose any taxation of maple. So I'm looking at flavored water. We have, that is on the not included list, but I'm suspecting, since of what you said about honey, that maple would fall into the taxable list, and it should not.
Representative Brannigan, we can absolutely, if we like wind legislative language about this, we can absolutely figure that out.
Okay,
That's not,
thank you.
yeah, we're on big picture. We definitely are not gonna talk about definitions of milk.
This is really important.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And if we're not doing this for the purposes of changing behavior, then maybe it makes sense to include diet drinks. I have no, like, I genuinely have no idea nor opinion.
So I guess one other comment I'll have is because this is an excise tax, it's not part of sales and use, so it would just have to be specifically labeled as this has to go to the ad fund. Right? There are others, there are no other states that do a sugar sweetened beverage, but there are several municipalities that do. There's a few in California, Boulder, Colorado, Philadelphia, which we actually did base part of our estimated model on. That's part of the estimate here. And then you see that the structure for the majority of them is similar to what we're talking about, excise tax on the wholesale level. So it's on the distributors rather than being paid directly by consumers. Likely that cost is passed on, right? But just the mechanics of it are a little bit different than sales and use. So I think so. Sorry, before I move, just the highest we saw here was 1.75 cents per ounce, which was in Seattle. We took a slightly more expansive range when looking at this. We went from a penny to 2 pennies per ounce. And for a penny per ounce, we're estimating so for fiscal year 25, you're only getting 11 out of the 12 because of the lagged effect. We would estimate about $15.2 million in revenue for fiscal year 25. Moving that up to 2 pennies per ounce, 29.8. And so actually one thing that's interesting that we built into our model a little bit more so than last year was, so in Philadelphia, they've actually seen a rather dramatic reduction in consumption of these types of beverages in response to
Really?
I think in response to their tax. So we actually did build in a little bit higher elasticity here with the expected price changes. Still not quite to the extent that they're reporting from Philadelphia. I think sometimes it comes back to the correlation causation question, whether the tax is really responsible here or whether, just general consumption of soda has been decreasing over time. But yeah, that was an interesting finding that we found recently.
Representative Beck, Anthony, Bodie.
Represent reduction in consumption or reduction in purchase?
That's a good question. I'd have to look at the article again to know if it was a newspaper article, so
Yeah.
they're not always extremely careful with how they phrase it.
Okay.
Not to like denigrate anyone, obviously. But they're not always academics writing the words.
Yeah.
But I can look into that for sure.
Back to my distinction between the use of the word sugar as a predicate of sweetened or just sweetened, because it really, I think, and this is my question, doesn't it noticeably change the revenue picture because it changes the base? And what's the magnitude?
So one thing, just quickly, you'll see that when we go from a penny to 2 pennies, we're already assuming that the revenue is not doubling here. So 15.2 is less, like times 2, more than the 29.8 for the 2 pennies. So we are building in that sort of behavioral response factor. And does that get at your question?
No, my question is about the expansion of the base, not the numerical assessment per ounce or per gallon. The base would be larger if it included sweetened beverages by any means of sweetener, not just sugar.
Oh, certainly, yes.
Okay, so what's the
Sorry.
magnitude?
Ooh, I don't have the number with me, but I think it was not quite doubling, but it was approaching doubling.
So significant in any case,
Sure, yeah,
without even changing the 1 to 2 ounce, the pennies an ounce.
yeah.
That's what I was getting at.
Sorry, yeah,
Thank you.
thank you for clarifying.
Yep.
My question was asked.
Oh, okay.
Because Philadelphia's got borders, so I'm just imagining there might be stores right outside the borders selling a lot.
Well, yeah, you go to any suburb just outside the city limits, right?
Soda field trip.
Yeah, right.
I don't think that's what people mean by road soda, but.
Oh.
Candy.
All right. So currently in Vermont, we do exempt groceries from the sales tax, and candy is treated as a grocery. We don't have to treat it as a grocery under Streamline, but that's just currently how it is treated. There is a variation among states about whether they do include groceries or not, and some consider candy a grocery, some don't. So there is just kind of a spectrum on how states treat this. But there's no legal reason why you have to treat it as a grocery or not, right? I know there's always questions about candy with flour and stuff like that, but I know you had Jeff Dooley in to talk about whether it has to be includes flour or not, whether you can exclude it or not. I don't have the answer to that right now. I'd probably refer that to him. But yeah, so overall, there are 27 states and Washington, D.C. that do apply the sales and use tax to candy. We estimate that for fiscal year 25, again, this is an 11-month estimate. So if it was 12, it'd be like 4 million. But for fiscal year 25, we did estimate about $3.7 million in revenue. So not the biggest source here, but I know it's something that's been talked about in this committee anyway before.
Okay.
The streamlined sales tax compact,
Yes.
this would run afoul of them.
No, this would not. We do treat it as a grocery, but we're not required to under that compact. Okay. I have a duplicate cover slide. I'm pressing the wrong
You're
button.
going backward.
I'm going backwards. Thank you. So one thing that was not included the last time we talked about this was something that the state actually did used to do, which was exempt clothing under a certain price threshold. So currently we do exempt all clothing and footwear, and some examples of what is included in that are in this list here. I can go through it line by line, but I'm also going to show you some instances. So one thing to look at, so hats, caps, earmuffs, gloves, and mittens. So for warm weather wear, there is a category that is not considered clothing or footwear and is therefore not exempt. Within this are protective equipment, which you'll see here that protective gloves are not included and do have the sales tax applied to them. So your winter gloves, not taxed. Your work gloves that you use to do your gardening or whatever are taxed. So
What if they're lined? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm so sorry.
I
I'm
was like,
a little, having a little too much fun today. Okay.
so generally protective equipment not included and so therefore taxed. And a lot of sports and recreational equipment is also not exempt. So I mentioned that this is something we did in the past, but just looking at the statutory intent is something that is always interesting to look at when thinking about whether the policy makes sense for what you're trying to achieve. So the statutory intent for this is to limit the tax burden on the purchase of goods that are necessary for the health and welfare of all people in Vermont. Basically you want to make sure that the clothing and warm things that people need to buy are affordable for people at all income levels, right? Well, is the intent necessary for that also to apply to the, just where the idea of this threshold comes in? And previously Vermont had exempted clothing that was less than $110 from the sales tax. But when we joined the Streamline Sales Agreement at that time, that exemption, actually was talking with Kirby today, and he indicated that it was 2016 when the Streamline Sales Tax Agreement did not, or said that this was allowed. And there are some other states that do this. Rhode Island does it, New York does it, and I believe Massachusetts also does a similar thing. So there is a history in the state of having this threshold exemption
It's per object.
for objects.
Per item, yeah.
Just, would you mind going back? So $110 threshold in 2007. I think a lot of things have happened economically that since that time that makes 110 seem suspiciously low.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
You know what I mean?
yeah, I have an estimate there for 110 just to show if that had never been removed, what we'd sort of be looking at now. Other states I've seen don't have it that low. I think Rhode Island might be as high as 250. New York is around 175.
And Streamline has no recommendation on where that threshold is. It's just that you can have a
You can pick
threshold.
whatever you want. I mean, it might be a little odd to do $5, but you could pick whatever you want.
Representative Sims?
I assume this would be something very easy for a software program for a retailer to handle, is that? I see nodding heads, but like, no big deal, to be like.
It should
"I'm
be.
this."
I mean, I've known vendors work with businesses across many states, and to the extent that they do business with someone in Rhode Island, they should be able to handle that.
Have you seen any research or any, how this type of system would hit different genders?
I have not. Well, never mind. There's some anecdotal stuff from my work doing the basic needs budget work, but never started talking about lower thresholds here that might be appropriate for that report. Which is just why I said never mind.
Okay.
Great question.
Which one do you think it would disadvantage?
I think women, clothing, hairstyling, other things tend to be more expensive than men.
Agreed.
I don't know if that's true. I've seen research to.
There's some fancy suits.
The research, I mean, we can actually maybe find someone to talk to us more about this. I've seen that women tend to spend more overall on clothing, but individual clothing items are less expensive, but services and like toiletries, that's usually when people talk about the pink tax, it's the services and toiletries and not the clothing itself. But we can definitely dive into that. Yeah. Okay. If we decide that we want to go deeper on this.
Yeah, and so this is the range of estimates.
Still not a lot of money.
Still not a ton of money, and this is the 11-month estimate, right? And naturally, see, as that threshold goes up, you can expect lower revenue.
And both of, what's the timeline for money coming into the state from both of these? Is it monthly or quarterly or?
Sales and use, businesses are required, so let's say, we're in January right now. Businesses will be required to remit their, collections to the tax department by February 25th. So you're always on a 1-month lag, so if this becomes effective for July 1st, you're not actually seeing any bump up in revenue that you're collecting on July 25th. So you're kind of losing a month of any changes unless you make it retroactively, effective to June 1st.
Yeah.
So that's what we have for clothing. Now, I know that Ted was in here last week to talk to you about cloud tax, and this is a repeat of a lot of information. Would you like to see it again or skip ahead?
I actually think it's helpful to see it again because I hear that people have different questions every time we touch it. So let's do it one more time.
Okay. So, lot sales tax applies to the retail sale of tangible personal property. The word tangible there is important when thinking about this particular product. And then, of course, unless there's an exemption that applies, which we detail in the tax expenditures report. So tangible personal property does include pre-written software. But usually, I mean, that means that think back to like when you'd buy a disk with a program on it and you'd load it into your computer and have, you'd be hosting it locally to run the program. The distinction here is with a lot of the technological advances and everything is in the cloud, so you can access it and it's living on some server that's, in rural Nevada or something like that. It's not actually contained within your computer, hosted locally, sort of in your personal possession. So for that reason, it's kind of sort of fallen into under the definition of a service, which Vermont does not, for the most part, Vermont does not tax services under the sales and use tax. There are a couple of small exceptions to that rule, but generally they have to be called out specifically in statute that they have to be subject to this tax. So yeah, because it's treated like a service right now, it is not included. We do not collect any taxes on this. So there was a question a while back whether we should be including this as personal. Basically, there was a question: should we clarify this? And at the time, the session law from 2015 just said that because you're accessing it remotely, we're not going to be considering this tangible personal property. So that's something that was just clarified at the time and is sort of carried through. And there's still hasn't been changed to sort of consider it in any other way. I think that was everything from that slide. Getting into some of the examples. So past legislation that you've seen before last year and several years prior, I believe, just kind of looked at sort of three major players within this type of software that you're accessing remotely. I think SaaS is probably the one that most people are most familiar with, which is a service provider which hosts a software application over the internet for a customer. And I have a slide with some examples of what each types of these things are. So PaaS, which is called a platform as a service, provides the framework for developers to build on and use to create customized apps. And that'll be important a little bit later when we talk about customized software. And then infrastructure as a service is the last one, sort of providing the guts for hosting a lot of these types of programs. So what are some examples of software that you may all be familiar with? Includes things like TurboTax. So you go onto their website, you start filling out your tax form. It is an application that you're using, but you don't actually go and download that software anymore. You just go to their website and you can access it that way. So you're not hosting anything locally, which is why it's not considered, tangible property. Platform as a service would include things like Squarespace, which a lot of web developers use to create these types of applications. And then infrastructure as a service is the last one. This is, again, like a hosting platform that companies will use. We get there. So the estimate, again, this is an 11-month estimate. 20.4 million for fiscal year 25 if it became effective July 1st. That's an increase. Every year we show you what it said last year. Last year it was 18.4 million. I think the year before that it was around 16 million. So every year that we go to update this estimate, it's getting bumped up because this is a pretty rapidly growing industry. So I don't have a crystal ball to tell you when it might plateau, but we're still seeing quite high growth within this industry.
Representative O.
Yeah. So you say it's a fast-growing industry. Is that, how much of that industry is Vermont companies? And how much of it is out-of-state companies? That's possible to me.
Do you mean companies that are sort of domiciled in Vermont? Like a Vermont corporation?
Yeah.
I don't know the sector by sector breakdown of Vermont's share within the cloud computing industry. I could try and look into it, but typically what we work with when we do these estimates are national figures, and we have to scale to the size of Vermont to understand what the purchasing that's going on in Vermont is.
I think it's a worthwhile question to ask or not answer.
Well, we kind of approach this more from the what are people spending rather than what are corporations that are domiciled here selling. It's a little easier to get to the what are people buying question than what are people selling, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I wonder if having it puts our companies that are using it and selling it at a disadvantage to others that are using it and selling it.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess
Do you have a map of the states that you went through when I was gone from it? The state.
I don't have that in this presentation.
I really struck when I was at a conference this year with the first time I had this conversation, which I know was later than the first time some other people on this committee had this conversation. It was just a few states, and now it's really like a lot of states are doing this. And so the sort of competitive advantage, disadvantage thing. The other thing I think about in terms of competitive advantage and disadvantage is in that third category, we're talking about two global corporations with like 99% of the market share. Neither of which are domiciled here.
It's
But yeah,
Yeah, two things.
the
Sorry.
buyer base.
Representative.
I mean, two things. Let's not forget, this is a trust tax. It's the consumer paying it, not the business that's providing the service. Okay. And two, is that 20.4 million? Is that for everything, SaaS, PaaS, infrastructure as a service? Is that everything or just,
That's for those three categories.
that's all three? Yeah, okay.
And I
do you
could, I
have a
could break that
breakdown
out.
of- Okay.
I'll send that to you.
I'm sure I think there is a mix between the states, not all of them do everything.
I do remember, I think one of the reasons we moved to the everything was because when we tried to do 1 and 2,
Yeah.
we wound up with a lot of folks coming in saying, you can't do this because the boundaries are not crisp between these things. And so we said, well, then we'll just do all of it. Yeah, definitely.
Pat, I'm assuming that that's on the 6%. That's
Yes. Yeah, good question. So later I'll show you what changing the rate will look like. Changing the rate would change all of these estimates, of course. But just think of it as like it's in a vacuum for now. The one last thing I will just add, which I think you're all aware of, is that these estimates do not include customized software. That's, even though it's being pre-written, it's being customly requested for a specific business for a specific purpose, even though it may still be accessed remotely. One of the reasons for that is that customized software typically uses cloud services to be built. So if you're then taxing that customized service, you run the risk of double taxing, basically. Okay. So
Wait, no, I have one more question.
yes.
I know this has been rapidly growing up, but just like ballpark, if we had passed this 5 years ago, how much more money would we have?
In about the last 5 years. Well, I know. So we have last year's estimate 18.4. The year before that was about 6.4, 6.8. And then going back 5 years, I want to say we started somewhere around 12, but I can look and see some of that's back when Graham was doing these estimates, but I can look for those.
It's okay. I was just making a point. You don't have to do math.
At least 50.
That's pretty easy math.
Or nothing depending
All right, so changing the sales tax rate is also something you can look at. I have the list of other Northeast region states and what their sales taxes are. Couple notes, obviously New Hampshire doesn't have one, but they do a lot of things very differently. So they're kind of both a good and not great comparison for this. And then one note for New York, they are the lowest in the region at the state level, but they rely a lot more heavily on what, we would think of as like local option taxes. They do a lot more taxation at the local and municipal level there. But you know, right now in Vermont, we're at 6%. We're below both Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. But, you know, above Maine and at the state level, New York. So, you know, it's still, we're sort of at a midpoint, we're sort of just looking regionally. Again, you kind of have to forget about New Hampshire for a second in that, which I know is hard to do.
Madam Chair, I think we should keep in mind which state on this list has the lowest population and which state on this list has the lowest average income.
What state is that?
Vermont.
Okay.
Is the answer to both those. Vermont. We are much smaller and much poorer than the others. That's just my comment.
The others, Connecticut, Maine, Mass, Rhode Island, do they do a local option tax or, you know, do they have county taxes or local sales tax on top of just like, you know, kind of like New York does, or do they?
You know, I don't know the question that off the top of my head, but that's probably something I should know and I'll look into that.
Okay.
So the most recent consensus forecast says that Vermont's going to generate about $607 million in sales tax in fiscal year 25. So what that does is that translates to a sales tax base of about 10.1 billion for that year. If you were to increase the sales tax by 0.1% over the course of, so that again is 11-month estimate. For each 0.1%, barring any sort of behavioral changes, we'd estimate about $9.3 million per 0.1%. I will say, I just mentioned any behavioral changes. We're still within sort of like the mid-ground with in comparison to immediate border states. New Hampshire being the exception.
But we're already we've already crossed the threshold on having a much higher tax than New Hampshire.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, even so, it's sort of just discounting them within the other states that do have this tax. We're still sort of in the middle. We're not, you know, higher or lower. So if you're thinking about it from a competitive standpoint, looking at those other states, we'd still be, you know, you're not sort of becoming a significant outlier, I guess is the way to put it.
It would seem to me, Patrick, just looking at that math there, 0.1 generates 9.3 million, that you're cranking in an expected loss in business.
So it's a great question, and actually something Ted had flagged as something that might look confusing. So the 10.1 billion tax base is the annualized tax base.
Yeah.
That's 12 months. Because we're assuming a July 1st effective date for all of these, it's an 11 out of 12.
Okay,
So instead of just moving the decimal point over a couple of spaces,
okay.
we're also taking out a month of revenue there.
So in that estimate there, it's the reason it's less than is because the 11 month, but you're not expecting a decrease in business activity and that in cranking out that number.
You know, I don't think that the 0.1% is, I'd have to do some, I'm not going to do math in public, but we're talking about a very small percent increase in the existing rate. So, you know, I think with looking at a increase of 0.1%, you know, I think that at that point it's modest enough that I wouldn't expect a huge change. The difference I do think comes in if you're talking 2-3%. Yeah, those are definitely more significant.
Okay, so that is just a straight math calculation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So is it safe to assume, just doing public math, if I take the 9.3.
And then asking you to verify it publicly.
I did on my calculator. Take the 9.3, divide it by 11 to get a monthly amount, multiply it by 12 to get a full 12 months. And then if I multiply that by 10, assuming a 1% increase, it's 101 million for a 12-month chunk.
That checks out.
Okay. So about 100 million.
1/6 of 606.9. That's what it is. Yeah.
Yes, you know, and this- Representative Anthony.
Thanks. My intuition tells me that raising it is off the table. And frankly, lowering it is attractive for a different reason. That is to say, the progressivity discussion that we've had. And then figuring out what augmentation revenue would satisfy the general fund in the process. That's a good discussion. As you can tell, my questions of Patrick focus on expanding the base together with the usual suspects of what are included already, and whether you substitute the word sugar for not sugar or seems to me worth talking about, because it does have a volumetric effect on the revenue.
So that's kind of good foreshadowing, because I do have a slide here on expansions of the base.
Before you go to that, I'm wondering if there's been analysis about, given that we don't include food in our sales tax, like who actually is paying it. I know Joyce said a few weeks ago, we really have no idea. So I don't know why I'm asking you, but if you have.
So we did do some analysis in the EITC review report. And so sorry, I have to give a little backstory here. Part of the intent of the EITC is to offset low income workers' regressive taxes. So we did do some little bit better than rough estimates on what we estimate people within the qualifying income ranges for that credit are paying. And we did find that in general, the EITC is doing a very good job of offsetting those regressive taxes. And we included things like any kind of fuel taxes, sales and use, certain service taxes that people are having to pay that are skewed towards the low end. And so we do have some sort of general information on what some of these lower income people are spending on it. It's not, I'd say, sort of academic research or tied to sort of national survey data. But we do sort of have like a sense, and that's also part of the exercise that's done with the basic needs report.
Okay, so maybe we can dive into that. Representative.
I have to say, I think most all of us know this, but let me say it anyway. Because the amount of prepared foods that fit the meal category are increasing as a percentage of expenditures at most food stores. In a way, we're chipping away for some people on the food exemption, because a meal is not food and food is not a meal, as it were. Yeah, meals tax.
So the last thing I have here for today is just basically a reminder. There are many, I have here, so there's at least 38 different tax expenditures, things that are not taxed under sales and use. For the most part, there are either products that make up a disproportionately high portion of lower income people's budgets, or they might be for certain products or industries that the state is trying to encourage people to buy. And so within the sales and use tax world, though our last report estimated that for fiscal year 24, the state was going to be foregoing about $330 million in sales tax revenue because of these exemptions. The big chunk of that is made up from just a few groceries, medical products, energy purchases for residents, and then clothing and footwear. Those together make up 270 of that estimate. So, I mean, there's 38, but it's really the big chunk here is that those four. So if you're thinking about significant expansions to the base, where you kind of have to head to is one of these four big categories, which, that's a policy decision that you all would have to think about whether you think it's a good idea or not.
And I would encourage us when we're thinking through these things to not think about whether we want more taxes or less taxes, but instead think, is this better or worse than an increase in the property tax? Representative Odie, I think you had a.
I did, thank you. You said groceries, energy, clothing and footwear, and what was the fourth?
Medical products, did you say that one?
That helps one, okay. Looked at the other way, what higher income people consume more of is services. And I swished the end of your report, I don't see services on here. Do you have presentation about services?
So I do have, we did talk last year about taxing services, and I did come in to speak to that. Also as part of Julia's levers presentation that she gave, there was a table towards the end that included, we sort of updated what Rand had just submitted as part of their report, some services estimates that they did that included there was a limited services package and then a extended services package. So, I mean, we can certainly talk about that more, but I don't have it in here. But again, you know, that's another sort of big ticket item. You know, it's something that's not taxed in the state. And if it were, you could expect some rather significant increases in revenue, depending on which ones you opted to make subject to the sales tax.
Right.
In terms of you're better or worse. Madam Chair. I look, probably first it's from your perspective. You know, there's the impact. And all these are possibilities, but I think the lens that I might first was getting hit.
I would make the point that it's, given how we currently define education spending and calculate the yield, this would be worse, because you get all of the taxes and you wouldn't knock your property taxes down at all. So,
What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
I mean, if you just pour money into the system, the districts are still gonna spend it up because it's cheap money. I mean, we've added in the last, with Wayfair, we've added a couple $100 million in sales tax to the education fund. And what's happened to property taxes? It's because the money's cheap to districts, and so they spend it. Got to redefine education spending and how the yield's calculated. If you're gonna do something like this.
I think there was another hand, but I've lost it. Yeah, Representative.
I just, not to beat a dead horse, the reason I was into sweeteners was because of the behavioral feature that public health people frequently point out that America's health is significantly challenged by obesity. And one of the chief contributors is sweeteners. So it's not without its, if you will, deterrent feature.
I mean, do we have data that suggests that? I mean, I feel like when I go to the drink cooler, I'm attracted to sugar because it's an addictive property. I'm not responding to a cent or two. But I'm sure there are experts who can tell us all about.
I do imagine us even beginning this conversation, we might receive some evidence. Because I know there's certainly like health related lobbies that are interested in this happening and have approached the committee various times about it. Representative.
I wanted to have a conversation going to what you just said. Scott, if we were to raise any of these things, whatever we decide to raise, and it was a permanent increase, then, then the argument that the more we put in, the more we spend because it's cheap. But if your argument holds water, it's not making your argument, but if we were to make a shorter increase, considering the current situation on the path to how we structure education and maybe a new formula for funding education, then maybe it's a bridge to that.
Yeah, I don't think you need to change the formula. I think you just need to redefine what education spending is. That's the problem. Education spending is this big. The amount of revenue that the homestead providers provide is this big. And that's what causes that disconnect, that loose connection between the district spending decision and their rate. If you reduce that delta, it tightens up that connection.
I also think there's something interesting about, the way a sales tax or a sugar sweetened beverage tax would be distributed across the state. Compared to way sort of the property tax is very particularly calibrated to sort of where property tax wealth is and where it isn't, and spending is and isn't. And so I think that's sort of an interesting piece of sort of how the distribution of that might work or not work.
One thing I definitely should have mentioned prior when we were talking about that excise tax is because it's a quantity-based tax rather than a value-based tax. It's not something that's going to grow with inflation over time like you see with the sales tax. So if the price of soda goes up, that doesn't mean that you're collecting any more money. But if the price of, we were talking about work gloves goes up, if that goes up in value and people still have to buy them, you're going to be collecting more money per pair that you sell. So it's basically going to flatline or even decrease over time. So just when you think about the stability of funding sources over time, that could be a potential drawback with having that for a dedicated purpose.
And then one sort of other spot where the Ed Fund gathers resources is meals and rooms. And what's sort of the scale of, say, a 1% increase on that?
Let me look at my cheat sheet. So if we were looking at a 1% change in meals and rooms, you'd be looking at about 6.6 million into the education fund, with the other 3/4 going to the general fund. So it gets a small sliver of the pie, of that particular pie.
What is meals and rooms? What percent is it right now?
9. And so 9 and 10.
Oh, local option.
It also gets charged on spirits, right? Get a drink at a bar.
Yeah, meals, rooms, and liquor. Yeah.
It like depends whether you drink it there or you take it to go.
Yeah.
Part of meals and rooms also goes to clean water fund and the general fund, is that right?
Yes. I think so.
What, do you remember what those percentages are?
Not precisely. I'd have to ask Ted.
Small.
So he's been working on some clean water stuff recently.
So, like, he just talked to us about it about 5 minutes ago.
Very recently.
2% are going on, 2%.
Yes,
I don't know if you're taking the pulse of any of us.
I really don't know what I'm doing.
Okay, I mean, I find the pre-written software particularly compelling. It's a growing market, everyone else is doing it. Like, there might have been a rationale early to help incent new industries. I think we're well beyond the pilot phase.
Let's add on that. We used to tax all that stuff, but it was disc and download.
Mhm.
And we're just giving it away, basically.
I also appreciate that doesn't have the same kind of regressivity as some of other things that we just discussed.
Is that your final slide?
I think I've got a slide for questions and then a couple of links with plugs to reports that our office has written.
Thank you very much. We're gonna take a break until 11:30.
Whoa.